Well, good morning. It's good to be here. See if this works. Oops. There we go. Energy abundance and energy affordability is key for economic prosperity. It's been well noted that these things are highly correlated together, that they rise and fall together. What's more interesting, and if you look at more recent econometric analyses that measure these two things, economic growth and energy consumption, some studies are now starting to tease out whether it's causal, whether energy consumption is actually causing economic growth rather than just being corollary. In fact, Ross McKittrick, who's speaking here later this afternoon, wrote a report in 2014 that looks at this and finds that causality, which makes getting energy policy right even more important. My talk is a tale of two energy policies, so you probably can figure out where this is going. If you look at what the past 8 years got us, it was centered around these three principles: catering to the environmental activist notion of keeping it in the ground, that fossil fuels are an antiquated energy source, that we need to transition away from them in any way possible, despite the fact that they provide 80% of the world's energy needs, that they provide 80% of America's energy needs, and they're likely to continue to provide close to 75–80% of the world's energy needs up until 2040 and even going forward. I don't know what the future will look like. As Paul said, it's impossible to predict, but if you look at the need for affordable, dependable power, not just in the developed world, but in the developing world where 1.2 billion people don't have access to affordable, reliable electricity, 17% of the population, and they're building coal-fired power plants at a record clip. Fossil fuels are going to be an important mix in our nation's energy portfolio, but also the world's energy mix. Centering an energy policy around climate catastrophism, that fossil fuels are going to result in the Statue of Liberty being up to her hips in water, is what's driving and what's driven a lot of this energy policy, whether it's been the regulations on power plants, the Clean Power Plan, the new source performance standards for new power plants that effectively prohibit the construction of new coal-fired power plants, going after energy infrastructure like Dakota Access or Keystone XL, really all over the place. Even regulations that were intended to regulate other sources of emissions. The Mercury, Air, and Toxics rule was pretty well disguised as a way to kill coal. If you look at the costs and benefits of that regulations, the benefits of the actual mercury reduction from that regulation were something along the lines of $5 to $7 million out of $50 to $70 billion in projected environmental benefits. So 99.999% of the benefits that the EPA used to justify this regulation came from what's known as co-benefits, or emissions that are already covered by existing regulations, CO2 being one of them, but also, and most notably, particulate matter. And then this using other people's money to stimulate the green economy. They really doubled or tripled, quadrupled down on this idea that we can force technologies into the marketplace using taxpayers' money, especially with the stimulus plan, but also working with Congress. And this has really become a bipartisan, or has been, I should say, a bipartisan problem. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time on this because out of the Venn diagram that is the Trump energy policy and the Obama energy policy, there's some unwanted intersection here of the federal government picking winners and losers. And we can't trade subsidies for wind and solar for subsidies for coal and nuclear. This isn't two wrongs don't make a right. We can't have the federal government pretending like they're investors on Shark Tank. And for those of you who haven't seen Shark Tank, it's a show where Mark Cuban and other investors take ideas from people who come pitch their ideas. They invest in those ideas or projects or technologies, innovations, whatever the case may be. but they're risking their money. The difference in this scenario with programs like the loan guarantee program is that they're risking your money and they're risking my money. And so there's all sorts of moral hazard issues. There's putting taxpayer money at risk, which is a big reason to squawk about the problems with these programs, because we've seen black eyes on these portfolios like Solyndra. But it goes deeper than that. It's not just about the lost taxpayer money. It's about the market distortions that result from these policies. Yes, Solyndra lost $500 million of the taxpayers' money, and that's problematic. But it also lost $1 billion of private sector money. And that private sector money aggregated to that project once the Department of Energy announced that it would qualify for the loan guarantee program. And that's a huge opportunity cost. That's investments that we can't get back. And so it's not necessarily just about the taxpayer money. It's also about how private money aggregates toward public money once the Department of Energy and the taxpayers become a player in these projects. And then you see that the political rates of return are higher than the economic ones. That when you have lobbyists and politicians driving these decisions, it's easy for a congressman to support this project. The industry will say, hey, we'll build this in your district. You'll look great come re-election time. You'll help us secure a 5-year tax credit extension, even though it was only supposed to last 5 years to get us off the ground. And then we have this complicated mess of the federal government picking winners and losers, using the tax code, using regulations, using direct handouts, using Department of Energy grant money, whatever the case may be. Now I'm fearful that the Trump administration is doing the same, using their own mechanisms. They've offered loan guarantees for nuclear plants, and now they're talking through the notice of proposed rulemaking out of the Department of Energy to bail out nuclear and coal industries that are struggling to compete in the market. And yes, there are a number of market distortions that are resulting in part of these power plants' decline, renewable electricity standards in the states, targeted tax credits that allow wind to bid negatively, things like that. But you don't add more thumbs to the scale, and you don't add one crappy policy on top of other crappy policies. You get rid of the crappy policies, and that's what, as conservatives, as libertarians, we need to make sure we're pushing that message to the Trump administration. Now, if you look at what the policies, if they had been implemented by the Obama administration, would have done to the economy, it's quite clear they would not have been good. If these regulations to kill coal, to implement cap and trade legislation, to implement a carbon tax, to restrict the use of fossil fuels, these policies would have driven up energy prices so people use less, and that results in a huge deadweight loss to the economy, because energy is such a necessary component for everything we make and everything we do. You're not just hurt when you pay your electricity bill or when you go to the gas station, but when you go to the Home Depot, Walmart, out to eat. And this has a huge, huge dead weight loss to the economy. Using the Energy Information Administration's model, the NEMS model, a clone of that model, my colleague Kevin Diaratna, who's also presenting here later today, estimates that these are the costs you'll see from these types of policies. And it's also interesting to note, and the cap and trade debate has since passed, but if you look at some of the estimates of the cost of cap and trade, which would have restricted CO2 emissions, 83% below 2005 levels by, I think, the year 2050, depending on which bill you look at. Every economic analysis of this legislation projected costs. There was the Heritage Foundation that projected costs. The Brookings Institute, more a left-of-center organization, projected huge costs to cap and trade. Even the Congressional Budget Office and the Environmental Protection Agency projected costs to cap and trade. EPA had that message, it's only going to cost a postage stamp a day, which was just completely untrue because they didn't do a dynamic analysis of the costs of the legislation. But they still saw a cost. That message tried to change when they implemented the regulations. It was kind of this Paul Krugman-esque regulations, create jobs. We're going to stimulate the economy through regulations. But he doesn't have the Brookings Institute, he doesn't even have the EPA on his side when it comes to these energy and climate regulations. Now there's the flip side of that. If you look at how we can capitalize even more so on America's energy abundance, if we open access to our resources, if we become more technologically efficient, which the industry is aiming to do. Dan Yergin, one of the famous names in the energy world, said that the industry is now figuring out ways to operate in a $50 per barrel world, not in a $100 per barrel world. So we may not see drilling in the Arctic, we may not see it off the coast of the Atlantic, but it's important to actually have access to these resources, because the left and environmental activists will always complain that it's never a good time to open up these resources. If oil prices are high or the price at pump is above $4 per gallon, they'll argue that it takes too long to get this energy from the ground to the market. If oil prices are low, they'll argue that, well, the prices are too cheap, the industry isn't going to invest in these resources anyway, it's too expensive to extract out of the ground. That's not for them to determine, that's not for politicians to determine, that's for the market to determine. Where the policy is important is to open access, to reduce those regulations that are devoid of any meaningful environmental benefit, and then allow the market to work. And this is just looking at the benefits of expanded oil and gas exploration. If we see a 50% increase above the baseline, again, hundreds of thousands of jobs, tens of thousands of dollars in increased income for a family of four, and a huge bump in gross domestic product over the next 18 years or so. So how do we get there? One, I think the administration has laid out important reports that take hold of what they can do without Congress. And I think that's important. If you look at the energy burdens reports that the agencies have released, the Department of Interior probably being the most important one, they look at the regulatory rollbacks that will be important, the Environmental Protection Agency being the other important one, looking at the regulatory rollbacks to provide access to these resources. The Department of Interior is getting started on a new Outer Continental Shelf leasing plan, which I think is important because the Obama administration's one was more about what was placed off limits rather than what was accessible. And honestly, I think the whole system needs to be scrapped, because right now we do these 5-year leasing plans. It's like Soviet Russia Central Command style planning when it doesn't allow it doesn't allow the industry to act on these resources if there's a commercial interest that exists. Allowing states to manage our energy resources, even on federal lands, that's something that has shifted from just streamlining the federal permitting process to actually giving control to the states, even on the energy developments on federal land. If you look at where all the oil and gas production has occurred, it's been on state and privately owned lands. Part of that reason is because when these companies look for an application for a permit to drill, when they go through the licensing process, it takes on average 227 days for the Bureau of Land Management to get through that application. It takes the states a week, 30 days at most. There are things that can be done to streamline the process at the federal level, but ultimately we need reform from Congress that not only codifies these regulatory rollbacks, but empowers the states to control their own energy destiny. And then, again, removing all energy subsidies. I think that's critical. Repealing the renewable fuel standard, getting rid of the targeted tax credits, getting rid of the loan guarantee program for all energy sources and technologies to allow the market to drive energy innovation and meet not just the U.S. energy needs, but also the world's energy needs getting forward. And then I'll quickly mention nuclear regulatory reform, because I would disagree that we can't be dominant in nuclear. I think if you look at nuclear and what the private sector has done, these are remarkably efficient machines. When the private sector runs them, it's great. If you look at where nuclear is failing, It's on the licensing and permitting side, which is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They're only licensing and permitting large light water reactors. They're completely ignoring the availability of these smaller modular reactors and these new innovative technologies. So creating a streamlined pathway for these new technologies to compete, and then maybe you will see a nuclear renaissance that's been talked about for a long time. And then getting spent nuclear fuel, also something that the federal government has said they would take title of and completely failed, to the point where now the industry is suing the federal government. They won. Now we as taxpayers are paying the nuclear industry for the federal government not fulfilling its statutory obligation, and the system is broken. It's a sweetheart deal for the nuclear industry, but there's no real incentive for any type of change. So fixing the front end and the back end of nuclear, I think, can provide the opportunity for nuclear to be dominant. And I think if you have these reforms, it can take us from an area where we're already energy dominant in a lot of senses, but this will take us in most senses from good to great. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.